Good morning to all you here in Brazil, and good evening to all of you back there in Germany and in Europe. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, having you to assist our presentation from today about the federal government budgeting process in Germany. But first of all, I need to state that all statements here expressed by the Fundação Getúlio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV's official channels. And first of all, I have to say that this event here about the federal government budgeting process in Germany happens in the context of our research project here at the FGV, the so-called budget in numbers. And our guest today is the Professor Henning Tappe from the University of Trier in Germany. Professor Tappe is a friend of mine back there in my PhD studies in Münster in 2011, 2012 in Germany. And I'm really happy to have here Professor Tappe today with us. And we have also here to join us as moderator and panelist, our colleague here, Dr. Paulo Bijos. Dr. Paulo Bijos is a budget advisor at our Deputy of Chambers, and will join me as a moderator, and maybe we'll try to point some questions here to our guests. And I would like to thank you once again, Professor Tappe, or my friend, my dear friend, Henning. I'm really happy to have you here. It's an honor for our institution and as well for our graduate students. I'm sure that our graduate students are joining us today, since there will be a question about your webinar at the final test, in the clausura. So they need to watch you today, Professor Tappe, okay? And the idea, Professor Tappe, is that you do your presentation here as long as you want, okay? We'll have enough time for your presentation about the federal government budgeting process in Germany. And then we'll try to make you some questions and also maybe read some questions from the audience, if that is okay for you. So, Professor Tappe, once again, thank you very much for having you here. It's an honor. And I also hope you enjoy the event here today.
Yes, thank you very much for your invitation. So I'm just trying to share my screen and get to work. Just practiced a bit and hopefully it works now. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to me. If it's in the test, it's important, of course, and hopefully it's interesting too. So, since public finances are not an end in themselves, but state tasks are to be fulfilled with state resources, the starting point for public finance law is a material law, and all activities of the state predetermined by this kind of substantive law. Public finance law derives from the purposes it has to serve for these other fields, so like education, police, roads, and so on. You will always have to start with the question, who has to bear which expenses? After all, most states are not monolithic entities, but divided into different levels and units. And in the Federal Republic of Germany in particular, it must be decided whether the federation, the states, the Länder, or the municipalities, die Gemeinden, have to bear a particular expense. Just as the basic law, the German constitution, in GG abbreviated, assigns the states as powers and duties to certain levels. It also assigns the burden of costs to these different levels. Article 104A of the Basic Law at the beginning of the so-called financial constitution stipulates that the federation and the states, the Länder, shall separately finance the expenditures resulting from the discharge of their respective responsibilities. And this is referred to as the principle of connexity. The decision as to which expenditures are to be made and how these expenditures are to be made is the task of budget laws. So Article 109 of the Basic Law, the Constitution, stipulates that the Federation and the Länder shall be autonomous and independent of one another in the management of their respective budgets. According to Article 110, the budget plan established by the Budget Act is the basis of financial management for the planned budget year. On this basis, a distinction can be made between special budget law, which results from the annual budget, and the general budget law, which results from permanent laws, in particular the Financial Constitution, the Budget Principles Act, Haushaltsgrundsätzegesetz, and the budget regulations on federal and on state level, the Federal Budget Code and State Budget Codes, Haushaltsordnungen. The Annual Budget Act, the special budget law, provides for appropriations in the budget and authorizes the administration to make expenditures and to enter into obligations. The specific legal decision for what purposes which department is permitted to spend how much money on is thus made by the Budget Act. The budget always relates to a specific year and serves to determine and cover the financial requirements that are expected to be necessary to fulfill the tasks of the federal government in the budget period, and it constitutes a specific legal basis for budgetary and economic management. The Annual Budget Act is supplemented by general requirements as specified in the budget regulations, the budget code. On the one hand, these contain rules on drawing up a budget, on its structure, and on the necessary contents. And on the other hand, these cover general rules on implementing the budget once it has been enacted. For example, expenditures may only be made to the extent that and no earlier than they are necessary. In addition, expenditures may only be made for the purpose specified in the budget to the extent that and for as long as it continues, and only until the end of the financial year. We'll now get to the democratic procedure. And I have to switch my slide. Politically, budget legislation is a special event. Parliamentary deliberation of the budget, whose, in the language of the Federal Constitutional Court, sober set of figures, is a faithful reflection of the government's entire political program and is therefore traditionally a kind of general political debate in which all branches of the administration, from foreign policy, defense, domestic, economic, cultural, social policy, and the activities of the Ministry of Finance are reviewed with their expenditures and revenues. Legally, both budget and tax laws are normal pieces of legislation with only a few deviations from the usual legislative procedure. For example, the Budget Act may only be introduced by the federal government, not by members of parliament, not from the floor of the Bundestag. This government's monopoly on budget initiative is not expressly regulated in basic law, but can be derived from its systematics. In the case of the general budget, this means the original plan for the entire fiscal year and all departments. This monopoly follows from the simple fact that the government alone has the administrative apparatus for drawing up the draft budget. However, the argument of the complexity of budget preparation cannot be used to justify the federal government's sole right of initiative for less complex, for example, supplementary budgets. The monopoly on initiative may also be traced back to Article 113 of the Basic Law. Under this rule, all pieces of legislation that increase the budget expenditures proposed by the federal government require the consent of the federal government. It must follow from this that only the federal government is entitled to take the initiative, at least in the case of an increase in expenditure by means of a partial or supplementary budget. The budget has to fulfill certain standards of publicity, and the public nature of the budget is legally and historically a result of the parliamentary deliberation and adoption of the budget. On the one hand, the public nature of the debate and the search for decisions guaranteed by the parliamentary procedure makes it possible to reconcile conflicting interests. On the other hand, publicity in the legislative process creates a certain pressure to act economically. Public negotiation of argument and counter-argument, public debate and public discussion are essential elements of democratic parliamentarism, according to the case law of the Federal Constitutional Court. Decisions of considerable significance must therefore in principle be preceded by a procedure that gives the public the opportunity to form and represent its views, and that encourages the people's representatives to clarify the necessity and scope of the measures to be adopted in public debate. Against this background, the principle of budget publicity derives from the general principle of publicity in democracy. The budgetary right and overall budgetary responsibility of the German Bundestag, the parliament, are basically exercised through negotiation and decision-making in plenary session, through the resolution of the Budget Act, through financially effective laws, or through other constitutive resolutions of the plenary. Every member of parliament has the right to assess the federal government's draft budget and the amendments tabled to it. All members of parliament may present their concepts for application possibilities of the budget funds and to affect thereby the decision on the budget. In addition, members of the Bundestag of the parliament are entitled and obliged to exercise their power of control over fundamental budgetary decisions. The details are dealt with as elsewhere in parliamentary committees. In the case of proposals on budgetary and financial law, the budget committee must be consulted. In special cases, the Bundestag may, for compelling reasons of secrecy, delegate the approval of certain expenditures to a body of members of the budget committee, so-called confidential committee elected by the Bundestag. For example, the business plans of the intelligence services must be submitted to the confidential committee for approval. Only the Budget Act and the overall plan, the budget overview, financing overview, loan financing plan, have to be published in the Law Gazette. The individual plans are not published, although they have the status of enacted law. And this is seen to be justified by the fact that the Gazette would otherwise be kind of overloaded. The federal budget of 2022 consists of a total of 3,377 pages. In PDF document, of course. The Federal Constitutional Court has accepted a corresponding interpretation of the Article 82 that requires publicity in the Law Gazette because of the strongly traditional character of budgetary law. Referenda or plebiscites are largely excluded in the area of financial law. This is not surprising at the federal level of Germany, where there are no other direct decisions by the people on substantive issues. Therefore, the people participate in budget and finance legislation only through the election of parliament. Regarding the democratic significance of the budget and the emphasis placed on it by the constitutional courts, however, it is quite astonishing that direct democratic procedures in the area of financial law are excluded even where plebiscites are permissible in principle in the federal states and at the municipal level. In contrast to the federal basic law, the federal constitution, referenda generally are possible under all state constitutions. However, some areas are excluded from popular legislation, namely financial issues, financially effective laws, and all projects affecting the budget. Such exclusion clauses can be found in this or similar form in all state constitutions. Financial exclusion clauses already existed in the Weimar Constitution of 1919 and in the Constitution of the Free State of Prussia in 1920. The exclusion of the budget from popular legislation, from plebiscites, referenda, is seen as justified by the fact that only Parliament is in a position to have an overall view of all revenues and necessary expenditures to put them in an appropriate relation to each other, taking into account the budgetary requirements of the Constitution and the reservation of what is possible, as well as an overall concept for which it is democratically responsible, and to ensure that revenues and expenditures are balanced. Another purpose of the financial exclusion clause is to prevent certain interest groups from passing laws on their own behalf by means of popular legislation in order to obtain special financial advantages. This, above all, is also possible in the case of tax laws and salary regulations. By way of financial planning, a state guarantees its ability to act and ensures that it can perform its tasks in both near and distant future. Whereas the private sector usually plans the anticipated profit and loss account, kind of controlling, the state plans, taking into account the anticipated tax revenues, the provision of financial resources for the state tasks to be performed. For the more distant future, a medium-term financial plan has been prescribed since 1967 in the Haushaltsgrundsätzegesetz, the Principles Act. The purpose of this plan is to ensure the orderly development of the budget, taking into account the likely development of the economy as a whole, and in particular to set future investment priorities. The financial plan must be distinguished from the stability program, which has to be produced in mid-April along with other Euro area countries under European law, and which has to include multi-year projections for the public forecasts. For domestic planning purposes, the primary document is the medium-term financial plan, which is usually produced by the Federal Ministry of Finance as part of the annual budget process and is aimed at ensuring continuity of medium-term fiscal planning from one annual budget cycle into the next. The financial plan contains fiscal projections and plans for a 5-year period, the current year, the upcoming budget year, and the following 3 years. It is adopted by the federal government and submitted to Parliament alongside the draft budget in summer. The German approach is distinct in some respects from the type of medium-term expenditure framework or multi-annual ceilings that are used in other countries. It is notable that the financial plan is not represented as being binding, legally binding in any formal sense upon the budgetary processes, and decisions that come in subsequent years, and nor is the document formally approved by Parliament. It's being presented for information purposes only. However, in practical terms, the financial plan embodies a series of decisions and commitments relating to the conduct of fiscal policy over the medium term, and as such, it shows limited scope for discretion or ambiguity. Once the financial plan is laid down and agreed by government, it assumes significant influence over the shape of future budgetary policy unless some external effects as COVID-19 or wars disturb the planned course. This approach is closely related to the top-down budgeting mechanism, which I will get to in a moment. For the near future, usually for the coming year, the estimate of the necessary expenses as well as the expected revenues is made in the annual budget, which is established by the Budget Act. The Budget Act and the Budget Plan form a single unit. Budget planning in the form of legislation, as already mentioned, ensures transparency and binds budget management to an expression of the will of the democratically legitimized parliament. The estimation of revenues in the budget is a prediction of the expected revenues. It does not establish any authority to levy taxes, but presupposes such authority. On the other hand, the recognition of expenditures implies both an estimate of the probable need for funds and an authorization to make the expenses. However, claims or liabilities are neither created nor cancelled by the budget. This means the budget has no external effects. The preparation and adoption of the budget requires regular forward-looking planning in order to achieve the realization of the government program dressed up in figures, as the Federal Constitutional Court once stated, within a specified time frame. In addition to this planning, which is characterized by a forward-looking goal-oriented approach, there is also a retrospective control audit, which supplements the future perspective with a reference to the past. The actual current execution of the budget established by law is framed by planning and control. Budgeting is a periodic process known as the budget cycle, or circle sometimes in Germany. The reference point of the budget cycle is a fiscal year, which in Germany is identical to the calendar year. The annuality, the yearliness of the budget form the rhythmic leitmotif, the guiding principle within the cycle. The life of the budget is divided into we would see 5 phases when forming the sections according to the state powers involved in it. First, there's the preparation of the draft budget by the executive branch. Up to the preparation of the 2011 federal budget, the internal government budget preparation process was bottom-up. It was opened by the individual departments or other agencies responsible for a section of the budget, sending their budget application, their estimates, to the Federal Ministry of Finance, and then negotiating the respective departmental requests from the bottom up at the various levels of hierarchy. But since 2012, federal budget, the non-personal budget has been prepared top-down. Now, at the beginning of the budget formulation process, the Federal Ministry of Finance analyzes based on current macroeconomic conditions and forecasts, which requirements will arise on the basis of the constitutional debt rule and from other budgetary policy requirements for the coming fiscal year and the further fiscal planning period. On this basis, it prepares a draft decision to be approved by the cabinet on key parameters, which sets out the financial framework for the individual sections of the budget and determines significant revenue and expenditure items. This means that the focus is no longer on the requirements demanded by the individual departments, but on setting political priorities while complying with the framework laid down by financial constitutional law and, of course, the European law. Excluded from this new procedure are only the constitutional bodies, the Federal President, Bundestag, Federal Constitutional Courts, and so on, whose estimates will continue to be dealt with in the conventional method. So the second step is the deliberation and adoption of the budget by the Parliament, and I have already mentioned the parliamentary procedure. The third step is the execution, the implementation of the budget by the executive. The budget is managed in accordance with the provisions of the Budget Code and the Special Budget Act, the Annual Budget Act. Each federal minister manages the department in his or her own responsibility, and this principle also applies with regard to the legality and economic efficiency of all measures implemented. The budget officer is responsible for the implementation of the budget in each department that manages revenue or expenditure. The authorizations to make expenditures and enter into obligations granted by the budget are in principle only available to the administration until the end of the current financial year. However, exceptions to this principle exist in relation to expenditure for investments and expenditure from earmarked revenue, as well as expenditure declared transferable by the budget. The fourth step is accounting for the budget, rendering of accounts and the auditing of compliance with the budget by the executive branch and by the Court of Audit. Pursuant to Article 114, the Federal Ministry of Finance must submit accounts to the Parliament of all income and expenditures, as well as of the assets and debts in the course of the next financial year for the purpose of discharging the federal government for each financial year. And pursuant to Article 114 of the Basic Law, the Federal Court of Audits audit the accounts. This means the budget and the asset accounts, as well as the efficiency and regularity of budgetary and economic management. The Federal Court of Audit is independent in its activities, both towards the federal government and towards the Parliament, and its observations, the final report, the Federal Court of Audit summarizes the results of its audit activities insofar as they may be of significance for the discharge of the federal government. And this leads to the last step, the fifth step, the parliamentary audit and discharge. And in the final step, the Federal Ministry of Finance submits the federal budget accounts and the balance sheet for the previous year to the German Bundestag, to the Parliament, with the request that following receipt of the comments of the Federal Court of Audit, a decision to be taken on the discharge of the federal government. In separate procedures, the Bundestag and the second chamber, the Bundesrat, deliberate on the discharge of the federal government for the relevant financial year. In summary, the planning of the following financial year usually takes place in the current year, as does the accounting of the previous financial year. All phases of this cycle are interconnected, interact with each other. The budget cycle is characterized by the repeated sequence of successive steps, each of which is subject to its own responsibilities and rules. The budget law is guided by certain budget principles, and I will get now to some of the most important budget principles that guide our federal German budget cycle. The first is the I have to get further. I'm sorry, it's my pictures are a bit overlaid here because it's not animated in this version. I'm sorry for that. The first budget principle is the completeness and unity of the budget. According to the Constitution, it's Article 110, all revenues and expenditures of the Federation must be included in the one budget. Thus, two central budgetary principles are formulated in one sentence: the completeness and the unity of the budget. Tax revenue, in particular, must be entered in the budget as revenue without exception. In other words, no funds may be formed outside of the core budget in principle. In addition, all federal expenditures must also be budgeted for each fiscal year and entered into the budget so that all government activities are secured by the one budget. The constitutional principle of completeness aims at subjecting the entire state financial volume to budget planning and decision-making by Parliament and the federal government. And this is the only way to ensure that Parliament has a full overview of the financial volume available to the state at regular intervals annually, and thus also of the tax burden imposed on citizens insofar as they are subject to Parliament's responsibility. Pursuant to the Federal Budget Code, all revenues and expenditures that are expected to have an effect on the cash flow in the planned period must be included in the budget. It's called due date principle. And this means that all but only those revenues and expenditures that actually lead to a payment transaction in the financial year must be included. The decisive factor is not the point in time at which a payment or obligation is created or costs are incurred, but the point in time at which a payment is actually made, so it's cash flow. Budgeting according to the due date principle is a fundamental principle of the cameralistic, that's old word and complicated word, cameralistic budgeting. In contrast to double entry bookkeeping used in the private sector, it's not a question of allocating receipts or payments, income or expenses on an accrual basis according to the reason for their occurrence, so that there can be no amortization, depreciation, for example. Rather, only all cash movements of the budget period are recorded. However, reform considerations are aimed at introducing accounting standards at the state level and on municipal level as well, not on federal level and so forth. Second, the principle of completeness requires that the budget covers all government activities that are accounted for in the one and only budget. It therefore prohibits both black funds, revenues not shown as such, and expenditures for purposes not covered by the budget. Expenses may only be made, obligations may only be assumed if authorized by the budget. However, subsidiary budgets funds are not generally prohibited. In the case of federal enterprises and special trusts, only payments to or remittances from them need be included in the core budget, also called the central budget. Independent legal entities, such as the social security funds, have their own budgets. The unity and completeness of the budget is intended to prevent budget evasion. This means the use of shadow budgets for the purpose of concealment. Second, budget accuracy, clarity, and supplementary budgets. Closely linked to the principle of completeness is the principle of budget accuracy. From the constitutional requirement of budget accuracy follows the obligation to estimate with adequate precision. The budget approaches must be appropriate and justifiable from an ex ante point of view. The requirement of budget accuracy means that the claims of third parties specified in federal laws providing for money grants must be reflected in the budget because they are part of the expenditures likely to be made. If the administration is legally obliged to pay, the administration must also be authorized to make the payments. The budget must present all expected revenues and expenditures in a clear form so that they can be read off the plan as precisely as possible in terms of origin, purpose, and amount so that comparability is possible. This is meant by budget clarity. This also includes the rule that revenues and expenditures may not be offset netted, but must be budgeted in full and separately from each other. So we have a gross principle. If the budget must or should be adjusted to change circumstances, it is possible to amend the original budget by means of a supplementary budget. The supplementary budget is an amending act. It changes individual approaches of the original budget. For this reason, a supplementary budget does not have to be complete and can be limited to individual revenues and expenditures. A supplementary budget does not have the function of bringing the budget as a whole up to date with budgetary developments. It does not have to take over all transactions of the budget year that have been accumulated up to its adoption, but contains only substantial changes. Nevertheless, the budget as amended by the supplement must be complete and balanced. The amendment is made on a selective basis, but the results of the amendment must meet all the requirements that also apply to the original budget. A supplementary budget is always necessary if the existing budget is unconstitutional due to foreseeable unrealistic approaches and thus in the need of healing if subsequent deviations cannot be absorbed otherwise. So this is has a connection to another principle or another constitutional stipulation which deals with extraordinary expenses. We have the principle of total coverage, the principle of the balance of the budget, and it's kind of a formal principle. Pursuant to Article 110 of the Basic Law, the budget shall be balanced with respect to revenues and expenditures. This means the sum of revenues must equal the sum of expenditures because the budget serves to determine and cover the financial requirements that are expected to be necessary to fulfill the tasks of the Federation during the appropriation period. The requirement to balance revenue and expenditure is limited to a formal rule and merely serves to provide a meaningful presentation of the complete budget. So revenue also may include revenue from credits, so that even a budget with a substantial proportion of revenue obtained by the borrowing of funds can and must be balanced within the meaning of Article 110. However, there are also rules limiting government debt, which I will get back to later. The principle of budget balance does not obligate to make expenses or generate revenue in the planned amount, while the administration is obliged to collect revenues, especially tax revenues, in good time and in full. It is not mandatory that the budgeted amounts must actually be spent. When executing the budget, it is permitted to deviate from planning and to work towards surpluses, because expenditures may only be made to the extent that and no earlier than they are necessary for economic and thrifty management. Moreover, the funds budgeted are always based on estimates, which hardly ever accurately reflect the actual developments during the budget year. As a result, deviations regularly occur in the execution of the budget. Typical savings are often already taken into account in advance through so-called global shortfalls, globale Minderausgaben, but formal budgetary balance is regularly re-established while implementing the budget by transferring revenue from credits between financial years. The required budget balance applies equally to all revenues and expenditures. However, individual earmarks, the linking of revenues to specific spending authorizations, are not prohibited by the basic law. They are constitutionally permissible as long as the total amount of expenditure appropriations is covered by the sum of revenues. However, the principle of total coverage, non-affection, one could call it, is laid down in Section 8 of the Budget Principles Act. All revenues serve as cover for all expenditures. This means there's basically no earmarking of certain revenues for certain expenditure authorizations. So I think I will now skip the principle of economic efficiency and thriftiness and come talking a bit about it, and will now come to the annuality and previousness. Pursuant to Article 110, the budget shall be adopted by the Budget Act for one or more financial years, separated by years before the beginning of the first financial year. In this way, the Basic Law takes up the budgetary principles of annuality, yearliness, and foresight. Comparable regulations can be found in all state constitutions. The requirement of annuality has a long tradition in the system of public finance. I think it can ultimately be traced back to the course of the season, the annual harvest. However, it also fulfills important functions today. Separation by year has the purpose of making public finances comparable. It also secures parliamentary influence on budget planning. And both functions are reflected in the terms budget year and accounting year, which are, however, used synonymously. Although a budget must be drawn up for each year, this does not mean that a budget law must be passed every year on a recurring basis. Multi-year budgets are also permitted by the Constitution, and in these cases, the budget principle of annuality is transformed into the principle of periodicity. However, Section 9 of the Budget Principles Act limits multi-year budgets to 2 financial years, so-called double budgets. However, the admissibility of double budgets only simplifies budget preparation and the legislative process. 2 budgets can be adopted jointly and, if necessary, their contents reconciled. But since the budgets must in any case be drawn up separately by year, the budget balance must be drawn up separately for each accounting year. Therefore, even the double budget does not allow balancing across the boundaries of the financial year. The budget law must be enacted before the beginning of the relevant accounting year. In the case of double budgets, before the beginning of the first accounting year. And the principle of priority arises from the nature of the budget, which is as a plan intended to set a binding framework for all agencies managing public funds. It aims to secure the budgetary sovereignty of Parliament in terms of time and to guarantee the budget's management function for the entire financial year. The principle of previousness results in an obligation for all parties involved in the budget legislative process, since the draft of a budget law must always be introduced by the government, monopoly of initiative. This exclusive right of the government to take the budget initiative corresponds to a duty to introduce a draft budget in Parliament in good time, so that it can be passed before the beginning of the financial year. If the budget law is passed late, this procedure violates the Constitution, but the Budget Act is nevertheless valid and has a retroactive effect back to the beginning of the accounting year. The emphasis on the precedence for the budgetary sovereignty of the Parliament stands in astonishing contrast to the earlier state practice. From 1949 to 1979, not a single budget at the federal level was passed on time before the beginning of the fiscal years. On average, it was 152 days late. Since the 1980s, there has been a marked improvement in this regard, and the obligations under EU law to submit the budget to the EU Commission in the European semester will force even greater observance of the principle of timeliness. And under the European Stability and Growth Pact, the European debt rules, each year the EU countries, the Euro countries that share the Euro at their currency must submit draft budgetary plans to the European Commission. And the Commission assesses the plans to ensure that economic policy among the countries sharing the Euro is coordinated and that they all respect the EU's economic governance rules. The draft budgetary plans are assessed as either compliant, broadly compliant, or at risk of non-compliance. So if I think I can make this a little bit quicker. If the budget is not adopted in time, and on the slide you can see the lateliness of former budget. So if the Budget Act is not adopted in time, not before the beginning of the respective fiscal year, the budgetless period must be bridged. And although tax revenues flow in even without an adopted budget, tax is permanent law, there is a lack of statutory spending and possibly borrowing authorizations. However, even without the authorizations expressed in the Budget Act, certain expenditures must be made. It is not possible to wait until the budget law has been passed, and due to the Article 111, which allows for expenditures that are necessary, there is no shutdown in Germany as, for example, in the US. So by the authorization of, or by constitutional law itself, by the Article 111, the federal government can make the expenditures that are necessary to maintain legally existing institutions, to implement measures already decided by law, to fulfill legally established obligations of the federation, to continue constructions, procurements, other services, and so on. When we have a Budget Act, budget appropriations may be used only for the purpose specified in the budget and only in the amount specified. This follows from the primacy of the law, which is taken up and concretized for the budgetary law as a principle of factual and temporal commitment in the budget code. Expenditure that is not provided for in the budget at all or is not provided for in the right amount may only be made if it is permitted by law or permitted directly by the Constitution. So every budget works with ex-ante estimates and cannot foresee all deviating developments occurring during the budget year. Therefore, Article 112 of the Basic Law, which is concretized by Section 37 of the Federal Budget Code, allows for expenditures in excess of budgetary appropriations or for purposes not contemplated by the budget in certain cases. These require the prior approval of the Federal Minister of Finance, which may only be granted in the event of an unforeseen and unavoidable necessity. Unforeseen, within the meaning of Article 112, is not only an objectively unforeseeable need, but any need that was not actually foreseen for whatever reason by the executive when drawing up the budget or by the legislator when discussing and establishing it, or whose increased urgency, which has acquired in the meantime due to a change in the factual situation, was not foreseen. So the vaccination centers in times of COVID-19, they were established by these provisions. A need is unavoidable if it is absolutely necessary and cannot be postponed. This presupposes that an additional expenditure is so urgent that the introduction of a supplementary budget or its postponement until the next regular budget can no longer be recognized as justifiable when reasonably assessing the respective situation. In the absence of temporal irrefutability, budget execution must await the decision of the legislator. While the Article 111 opens up emergency budget powers for the delayed budget for the budgetless period, which are intended to prevent state budgetary and economic managing from coming to a standstill. Article 112 of the Basic Law regulates the situation of a missing supplementary budget, which can provide budget execution with a new legal basis for the remainder of the financial year. The authorization of unbudgeted and above budget expenditures is subsidiary to the authorization by Parliament. Therefore, the Minister of Finance has a duty to communicate and to consult. He must check whether appropriation by the legislature, a supplementary budget, is possible and contact the Parliament for this purpose. Only after consultation should the way be free for the exercise of the competence from Article 112. However, constellations are conceivable in which a supplementary budget is not practical. In addition to cases of particular urgency, this can also be assumed to apply to expenditure below a certain level, a de minimis limit. Because the legislature itself must decide in which cases it will waive the continuation of its parliamentary budgetary rights, exceptions are provided for in Section 32(7) of the Federal Budget Code Act. And according to this provision, a supplementary budget law is not required if the additional expenditure in the individual case does not exceed an amount to be specified in the Budget Act, or if legal obligations are to be fulfilled. And this amount is usually set at 5 million euros and has been for several years. However, unbudgeted expenditures that exceed the 5 million euro limit in individual cases, or in the case of fulfillment of legal obligations, an amount of 50 million, must be submitted to the Budget Committee of the German Bundestag for information prior to approval, unless an exception is required for compelling reasons. So last step, the debt brake, the public credit rules in Germany. The current public debt law since 2009 stipulates that the budgets of the Federation and the states and the Länder shall in principle be balanced without revenue from credits. However, the principle of without credits shall be satisfied in the case of federation, when revenue obtained by the borrowing of funds does not exceed 0.35% in relation to the nominal gross domestic product. In case of the states, it's 0%. In addition, exceptions are permitted. The Federation and the states may introduce rules intended to take into account symmetrically in times of upswing and downswing the effects of market developments that deviate from normal conditions, as well as exceptions for natural disasters or unusual emergency situations beyond governmental control and substantially harmful to the state's financial capacity. However, a corresponding repayment provision is obligatory for the exemption in emergency situations. Loans taken out on the basis of the exceptions must be repaid within a reasonable period of time. In 2020 and 2021, the Federation and all the Länder have made use, for example, of this exemption to finance the additional expenditure caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. It is considered that because of the corona pandemic is a natural disaster or exceptional emergency situation within the meaning of Article 109 of the Basic Law. In a similar way, the European Commission also stated for the parallel provisions of the European Stability and Growth Pact that the COVID-19 pandemic as an exceptional emergency situation justifies exceeding the deficit limits. Since the crisis was beyond the control of governments and had a significant impact on public finances, the Pact's provision on exceptional events applied. Deviations of the actual borrowing from the permissible credit limit are recorded by a so-called control account. This remedies a defect in the previous law because the application of the previous investment limit until 2009 while implementing the budget was legally controversial, difficult in practice, and the control account can now be used to absorb deviations in budget execution. So let me come to my kind of summary and final remark. I think the budget process at the federal level itself is, at least the way I see it, quite well established in functioning. However, there are current problems in 3 areas in particular, which have also led to a significant number of constitutional court disputes lately. The first is the delay of the budget, which occurs especially after elections. Second, the switching to special purpose vehicles and funds, so outside the core budget, with the risk of circumventing the annuality of the budget, and above all, being able to use credit funds too flexibly. And third, the regulations regarding the public credit, the so-called debt brake rule, which are now in part considered too stringent due to the major investment backlog of recent years, and because of the current global political changes. It started with a fiscal crisis in 2009, then we had COVID-19, now we have the war in Ukraine. So the need for funds is quite challenging. But this also will have to be discussed on a European level because the German rules are strongly influenced by the European Stability and Growth Pact. So I think I'm finished. I thank you for your time, for your attention, and I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tappe. I think it was an excellent presentation. Also for our graduate students, I'm sure about that our graduate students have understood your presentation. It was perfectly clear and complete and gave us a whole panorama from the federal government budgeting process in Germany. And I noticed that you could also focus in some special issues that actually we are facing nowadays in Brazil. But before you allow me to make you some questions, and Paulo as well would like to make you some questions, Professor Tappe, I would like just to reiterate here that our research project, the so-called budget in numbers, has as focus some democratic and Republican issues regarding all these procedural dynamics in the budget system. And we are comparing our budget system, the federal Brazilian budget system, with the German one, the North American one, and the French one. And of course, we are trying to focus in these democratic relations between the executive branch and the legislative branch, as well as maybe some other interactions, okay? And when I say other interactions, I mean also interactions with the so-called interest groups, and you mentioned, yeah, some kind of relation from the parliament with some kind of interest groups, and maybe with some independent institutions. But first of all, Professor Tappe, I tried here to condense some questions, okay, for you in 4 questions. And I'm also thinking about our graduate students so that they can also understand what we are trying to explain here. And first of all, Professor Tappe, we talked about this issue before your presentation. And I mean, about the earmarks. We have some worry here in Brazil about the earmarks because this is an issue we are discussing in the past 2 or 3 years in Brazil. Because as you have said in your presentation, it can happen that a huge amount of revenue would be binded with these earmark funds. And this is the discussion nowadays here in Brazil. And the discussion has also already reached our Supreme Court, our Bundesverfassungsgericht. And this issue about the earmarks here in Brazil, as far as we have noticed by now, presents us a considerable problem of lack of publicity and transparency. So my question for you, Professor Tappe, would be, of course, in the German reality, how does it really work? How do these earmarks work in Germany in matters of publicity, transparency, control, and also these interactions regarding the earmarks, these interactions between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Mainly when you focus these principles, yeah, the publicity principle or the transparency principles that are Republican and democratic principles. And after that, Professor Tappe, if we could explain to us, how does it work in Germany when we regard these so-called interest groups and their different kinds of interactions with the parliament? I also mean here in these questions, lobby. Also lobby? Okay, how does it work in Germany? Is there some kind of law, a specific law about that? Is there some kind of a specific control, for example, from the Bundesrechnungshof? Yeah? And at least, Professor Henning, about the independent institutions. We have already read and regarded here, when we read some documents about the German experience and the German reality in the budgetary system, that there are some important independent institutions. I mean, outside the parliament, outside the Bundestag, that can also work as some kind of advisory boards, doing, for example, some economic and fiscal forecasts. I would like to ask you precisely about that. What is the role of these institutions or advisory boards outside the parliament, the Bundestag, yeah, in all this budgeting process in Germany? How do they work? How do they interact with the legislative branch? Okay. And of course, I have talked with my colleague here, Paulo Bijos, that I would make you some general questions, okay? And then Paulo would try then later to make you some more specific ones, if that's okay for you, okay?
Okay, so I'm trying to begin with the earmark question. So we have to differentiate between taxes, special levies, and loans. So when dealing with taxes, we have the principle of total coverage. So all revenues from taxes can be used for all expenditures. This is different when dealing with some levies. There are kind of Germany special levies, Sonderabgaben, which are which go into a special fund and can only be used for special purposes. This is not the case when dealing with taxes. There are some taxes where this has been tried. So the tax on cars is said to be used for street construction and so on, but this is not legally binding. But for some levies, it is legally binding. The more important part is the use of borrowing funds, so loans, public debt. The special funds I was talking about in the last years were not really funds. They had no real money in it. They were kind of a place to borrow loans. So there was no real money in it. They were credit financed. And in this case, when dealing with a special exemption, I mentioned the public debt rule that has an exemption for natural disasters or special emergency situations. And from this, the kind of earmarking results, because you can only use the credits to prevent those disasters, or in the case of COVID to make expenditure that has to do with those things. And there were a lot of constitutional cases in Germany, in the states, not on the federal level, but in the states, that dealt with this problem. So can you use a public loan that has been borrowed with the exemption of for example, COVID-19, and use the funds to make expenditures for climate change or for other things? So there we have some kind of earmarking that goes back to the specific exemption of the public debt rule. But in other cases, especially in case of revenue from taxes, we try to uphold the principle of total coverage and try to make little use, as few as possible, to these special funds. But nowadays, I think I had it on one of my slides, when you just try to get back to it, probably I can share this slide once again. No, I think it was on the very, just take
your time. You don't need to.
Yeah, I'm trying to share my slide once again. Just a tick. Try to make it so. I hope you can see it. We have here, when dealing with the example of the budget 2022, we have a total sum of 457 billion euros, also Milliarden, also US billions, not real billions. And this is the total amount of the budget. But we have large amount of money in the special trust. So it's 130 billion in a special trust for climate change and for asylum problems. And we are now talking about a 100 billion euro special trust for the armed forces, which is completely funded from public debt. So you see from the relation 447 to 230 billion, it's kind of heavy earmarking nowadays, but it's a recent development, which has mainly to do with the crisis regarding COVID-19 and the crisis in the Eastern European region right now. It's not a normal situation, I think. But this is quite an example for the earmarking system that has been established in the recent years. I hope this answers the first question. When the second question is a bit difficult, dealing with interest groups. I think interest groups are always a problem in every kind of legislation, not only in the budget legislation, because of the exemption or if because of the referenda or popular are not permitted. It's kind of delegated in the parliamentary lobby. But there are interest groups, especially the interest groups that try to get funds for special economic purposes, solar energy, for example, nowadays, or rather, and interest groups that are trying to get the taxes down. The Bund der Steuerzahler is a very famous interest group. But I think it's normal, and there are no real special rules. I think Germany is a bit behind when dealing with interest groups, or even in the European context. There's kind of you have to register as an interest group, but there are no real, I think there are no real restrictions. When dealing with experts, economic think tanks, there are some economic think tanks that go into the debate and share their knowledge. And there are also some kind of think tanks that have a legal basis, and they are kind of official. We have the Council of Economic Experts. The Sachverständigenrat consists of economic experts, professors of economics, and they have they are constituted by law, and they have the right and the duty to render a report every year. And this report deals with the macroeconomic issues. And we have a second body, the Stability Council, which goes back to European law, has to be established under European law. It's now to be found in Article 109A. And this Stability Council has the duty and has the right to check whether the states fulfill their constitutional duties regarding the debt brake, regarding economic structure, and so on. These are official bodies, you can say, established by law with a clear task. And of course, there are a lot of other institutions that talk and that want to be heard and so on, but they have no official use, and they are connected with special interest groups too. So some economic experts are financed by the unions. Some are financed by the industry and the richer. So I think it's kind of normal nowadays that different economic think tanks have kind of interest groups behind them.
That's perfect, Professor Tappe. Thank you very much. I think you were really clear in your answers, and maybe we have some questions also here for you. And we have a question here. If Paulo, if you allow me, maybe to read this question before I give you the word here to do your questions. Is that okay for you, Paulo?
Sure, Gustavo. Feel free.
Okay. And Professor Tappe, we have received a question here from the audience, okay? And the question is there a budgetary control on the fiscal impacts of new legislation being proposed as a preliminary of the merit of the substance of each legislative change? If yes, how does it connect the budgetary and the common legislative process?
Okay, yes, there is. In each bill has a foreword, and in this has to be some aspects of fiscal impact, of impact on citizens regarding work, administrative work, and also regarding fiscal burdens on them. But it's not real connected to the budget process. I think it's kind of remarked before the bill, and the legislator or the initiative is obliged to do it. But I'm not really sure how it is taken seriously, to be honest, or how it relates to the budget, because the budget process of course has to deal with costs that result from other legislative aspects. This is every expenditure that is legally binding is must be in the budget, of course, but there's no real connection between the legislative process, despite the fact that it's the same parliament dealing with it. But I don't think it's kind of there's this established connection or an institutional link between those two ideas. Probably it's kind of held in the Federal Ministry of Finance as a note, but there's no official, I think, no official connection built up between it.
Okay.
Just I could try to find a recent legislative bill to show it to you how this looks in practice. I'm not sure whether we have the time for it, but I can try to show it. But do go on with the questions. It's okay.
No problem, Professor Tappe. Thank you very much. I think you were really clear with your answer. And maybe Paulo.
So let me.
Yeah, of course.
I can show you. So I just try to share my screen again. I can show you the latest bill. It's a tax law dealing with the corona crisis, and in this bill, it's German, of course, but I hope you get the picture. In this case, there's formulated a problem and a goal, a solution, and then we have kind of the budget effects. So each bill has, especially tax bills, of course, have stated budget aspects for the next years. So it's always a 5-year midterm financial planning that is built up in it. So we have, in each bill, they try to give a statement of how this relates to the budget and to the financial planning. So this is to be found in nearly every bill. Also in other bills, but in other bills, sometimes it's not really, if you deal with family law, you cannot really put it in numbers. So they contain numbers, or these bills have numbers, but one cannot be sure if it's the right numbers. So, but in tax laws, of course, you can do it.
Thank you, Professor Tappe. And also, Professor Tappe, as far as I can remember, in what matters this question here regarding the budgetary control, the fiscal impacts, as far as I remember, you can correct me, as far as I remember, there is no control from the Bundesrechnungshof at this stage of the legal proposal, as you showed us. I think the Bundesrechnungshof, the Federal Accounting Court, does not do any control of the fiscal impact at this stage of the bill. Am I right?
Yes, and the Federal Court of Audit only has the right to it can control or audit the economical effects, but also in retrospect. So if the budget year is over, they have the accounting and from the Federal Ministry of Finance, and there they audit. They control whether the remarks are paid attention to in the following years, but it's always a retrospective audit.
Thank you. Perfect, Professor. Thank you very much. And as far as we have no further questions here from the audience, I think Paulo, I think you could make your comments as well and your questions here to Professor Tappe.
Perfect. Professor Tappe, thanks a lot for your presentation. It was very, very clear, objective, and insightful for the FGV project and for everyone that is watching us and that are interested in public finances and budgetary matters, especially in the point of view of comparative studies. As Gustavo said, we are looking for foreign experiences in US, German, France, aside Brazil. So I believe, Gustavo and Professor, we could see here that we, in spite of our differences, cultural differences and political system differences, we also have some common challenges, mainly in the fiscal field of fiscal consolidation and budget balance, things like that. So, and on the other hand, we also have our differences. So we have similarities and differences. I believe that it was more clear that we have a very different situation as far as earmarks are concerned. And maybe that has to do with our different political incentives and political systems, since Brazil and US are presidential system. In those two countries, we could see the earmarked phenomena more clearly. In German and France, more parliamentary system and semi-presidentialism in France. We do not see that phenomena happening. And my comment as far as earmarks are concerned has to do with a possible double meaning of the word, since I believe that in France and German, it has more to do with, it's more connected to revenues, revenues connected to specific spending. And in Brazil and US, it's more related to electoral connection. It's money spent in favor of electoral districts for offering particularist goods for that district, electoral district. And that has to do not only with electoral system and also, as I said, a presidential system. But I'd like to hear from Professor Henning Tappe if he sees any kind of electoral connection, pressure in the German budget process. And after that, I would like to go more to our similarities as far as fiscal challenges more in a macro level are concerned. Thanks a lot.
Okay, yes, because of the importance of the budget committee, members of parliament who are a member of the budget committee can, of course, earmark some expenditure to their local districts. It's kind of common, and it's always a nice news in the paper if you can make a connection between a special member of parliament, his constituency, and special expenditure. This is often the case in the German political system in the last years, said to be the case, must be a bit, with one party from Bavaria. We have a system, so in the first place, it's the parliament. So it has to be a party and a member of parliament in the federal parliament in the Bundestag. But we have a system that one party is kind of separated in two two parts. The one part, the CSU, is in Bavaria, and the other parts are in all other states of Germany, the CDU. And this party is so it's a Bavarian party on the federal level, and whenever this party is kind of part in the government, you can see a bit of transfer to this particular state. So in the last year, we had a minister of transport who was member of this Bavarian party, and there were a lot of autobahns built in Bavaria. So of course, there are political kinds of ways to funnel money to constituencies or to different states, but it's not I think it's not really in the system. It happens, of course, as it happens in other states and other countries too, and it's more coincidence when members of parliament have an important role in the budget process as a minister or as a member of the budgetary committee. So the members of the budget committee are very important persons, and they are experienced members of parliament, but they can use their power to get money to special interests. So if you want to build a museum in a special place, it would always be a good idea to talk to your local member of parliament if he's a member of the budget committee. They have kind of power. It's not a system, not a problem in the system, but it can happen, if I can say it so. It's not criminal or something, but it's members of parliament have their special ideas, have their special interests, and they are voted for because of their special interests, and they can make use of it. So I think it's a normal situation in a democracy.
Very nice to hear from you. It's a privilege for us to hear directly from a German professor that knows the German reality. Professor, my second question is more in a macro and fiscal level. In that sense, we also share a fiscal challenge of, I believe, since the 2008 economic crisis, all the world in Europe faced this challenge and looked for different and new institutions like independent fiscal institutions and new fiscal rules and so on. And I know that Germany is very influenced by, as you said, Maastricht fiscal rules and goals, like 60% maximum of debt to GDP ratio. And I believe that's an important target. And looking to that target, Germany has chosen to establish in constitution this debt break rule, which limits, as I understood, a maximum of 0.35% of like a flux of nominal deficit each year. As you said, Germany is considering to reform the system, and I'd like to know if it's on the public debate anything related to the learning process from the German experience with a more like a golden rule approach when the debt is it's connected to public investments. Is that happening in the German debate?
Yes, I try to share again one of a slide showing the public debt from 1950 to 2021, and you can see the constitutional changes in public debt rules quite easily in it. So we have had a time from the 1950s to 1969 where there were really no real public credit at all, because the old constitutional rules said their public credit could be taken or loans could be borrowed in very special circumstances. This changed in 1969 when the investment or invest rule. So you could borrow loans in the same amount as you did expenditure for investment in 1969, and also you had the concept of the Keynes concept of spending on credit to have an influence on macroeconomic aspects. So this changed in 1969, and you can see on the slide that beginning from 1969, public debt, the darker is a federal debt and the lighter gray is the public debt overall, increased to 2009 with a step in the times of financial crisis, and then the new debt rule kicked in. The new debt rule, which says no revenue from credits. The 0.35% is has a connection to the European rule that there are not only the Maastricht rule, which says 3% deficit per year and 60% overall as a debt, but they were concretized by so-called midterm objectives, and this midterm objective for Germany was 0.5%, and then the federation took 0.35 and the other 0.15 for the states. The states did not want, so it's 0.5 in it. But what I wanted to say is, you can see in the slide that from 2009 on, from the new debt rule on, there was they achieved it to decrease the borrowing from loans. And we had in Germany, before the outbreak of COVID-19, we had this so-called black zero. So we had really balanced budgets without any credits. And you can see it on the slide. We were able to reduce the public debt. Of course, it's has to do with a very low interest rates. So the expenditures from interest rates were very low. And so there are times, and they just end those times, but we had in the last years times where the federation got interest from the loans, so because of the negative interest rates. So we earned revenue from taking loans from others, and in those years the public debt was sinking, and now in the time of COVID-19 it goes up again, and it will go up again even more when financing this special fund I was talking about earlier for the armed forces because of the Ukraine conflict. On the other hand, one has seen in Europe, one has seen in Germany, especially, that the thriftiness in recent years had led to some backlog in investment. There are bridges collapsing in Germany, and there are lots of investment to be made in renewable energies, because we cannot be reliant on Russian gas and oil anymore. So there have to be a lot of new expenditures to be made. And this leads to the discussion of reform of the debt rules. But you have to see that the German rule is strongly connected to the European rules. The former investment rule was a classic traditional German rule, and it's the golden rule in most cases, and it has a long tradition. And the new rules, the new constitutional rules in Germany are kind of borrowed from the European level. It's a kind of how could I put it best? I think it's common knowledge that Germany, when introducing the euro as a common currency, was very fond of a strong currency in the tradition of the German Bundesbank, and had the fear that other countries, Southern European countries, would act otherwise. So in those years, Germany very much insisted on strict debt rules. And those strict debt rules were put onto the European level and then re-exported into the German constitutional system. Though in the first place, Germany proposed it on European level, along with other countries, the Netherlands and Northern European countries, against the Southern Europeans, which could not prevent it. Then when on the European level, the new system was formed, it was re-exported to Germany in the constitution. So they're very strong related to each other. But now, because of the prevalence or the superiority of European law, the German debt brake has to conform with the European law. So we cannot. We can discuss it, but we have to discuss it on the European level, because we of course could change our constitutional rule, but we would still be bound by the European rules. And so it has to be a discussion, a debate on the European level among the Euro states. And I think it's a debate some countries are just waiting for. France, for example. I don't know if you talk to a French colleague later on, and other countries. It's a kind of north-south dialogue in it. The northern countries, for example, Netherlands, Germany, and the southern European countries, and now with the conflict in Ukraine, there's also a kind of difference between the Western European and Eastern European countries, because they have different costs to bear because of the crisis now. But this debate will have to take place on the European level first, I think.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Professor Gustavo. I'm okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Tappe. I think I have one last question for you, Professor Tappe. Maybe it's a comment. It's a comment about the earmarks. Yeah, it surprises me when you say that the so-called earmarking system, in Germany, it's something that does not belong to the budgetary system. Okay, it's something not legally anchored, but it's something that happens. It's as far as I have understood, it's something that happens because it's something that naturally belongs to all this democratic system or democratic system. Also in presidential countries, parliament countries as Germany, yes, it's something natural that the citizens vote in someone, and this someone gets elected, and then it starts some kind of interaction between the citizen and this now politician, this deputy, for example, and then of course there may rise some local issues, some district issues, for example, someone that lives at the countryside needs a hospital, needs a road, needs maybe another public school, or maybe needs some other kind of sanitary infrastructure. And then the citizen calls his deputy, and asks him if he can do something related to this local issue, And then this politician maybe articulates his political agenda and tries then to implement some budgetary solutions regarding this local problem. And it surprises me that you say it's something normal, Yeah, that happens. Yeah, but I was thinking about, but what really happens, Professor Tappe, when, for example, the amount, the amount of money that is involved in these earmarks, because you have mentioned, okay, some 130 billion euros for an environmental fund, okay, and then some other 100 billion euros for the army, yeah, regarding yet now the Ukrainian war. Okay, I have understand these issues, okay, and as far as I know, they built regarding this in Germany the so-called Sondervermögen, some kind of Sondervermögen, yeah, a special fund, yeah. But I mean, regarding all these little local issues, for example, the hospital or the public school at the countryside, when the amount of volume of these issues, yeah, for example, here in Brazil, that amount may be some kind of 30 billion reais. Paulo can confirm that information for me. Is there, Henning, any kind of control, for example, for the Federal Audit Court regarding this kind of issues? I mean, really local issues that the citizen maybe calls his deputy, send an email to his deputy, and hey, try to help me here. I have this issue here. I need a hospital. Maybe you can allocate some money for this hospital here at my city, auf dem Land, sozusagen, yeah.
I think the problem is not so big in Germany because, first of all, we have the top-down process. So the large amounts are set from the whole process begins at the top. So from the Federal Ministry of Finance, and there's no room, I think, for influence on this level because the political goals are defined. High above the problems we're discussing now. The interesting part is when the budget draft, the bill goes to the parliament, goes to the budget committee. And in this phase of the cycle, every member of parliament can make amendments, can propose some special expenditure or special interest or whatever. And this member of parliament must persuade his colleagues or his or her colleagues. You must have a majority at the end. So, of course, some of the special countryside issues or something can be kind of hidden in the large budget. Normally, these are not very large sums. So, if you deal with a budget consisting about 500 billion euros, if you build a shed for bicycles in the countryside, nobody will really notice. But it has to be in the budget, one of the 3,000 pages of the budget. And of course, it's public. So everyone can look into the budget, everyone can see it, everyone can download it as a PDF and search through it. And of course, the Federal Court of Audit can do it too. And of course, they will have a special eye on those issues because in most cases, those influenced aspects are not the economic expenditure. They are influenced from another aspect, from another standpoint, and not so in conformity with the larger aspect. So, of course, the Federal Court of Audit will notice it, will discuss it, and it could be a fire back to the member of parliament because his or her colleagues in parliament could speak to him and say, what have you done there? Why did you do it? Is not good publicity for us, and so on. So I think it goes in both ways. You can try to make an advantage for the next election, but it's also a danger for individual members of parliament who try to do it. So I think they have to do it very cautiously and have to connect it to ideas or political goals on a larger level. So it would be much easier, I think, to when a member of parliament at the North Sea tries to get a large solar or wind energy park, because it has to do with the broader goals of politics. But such things as a hospital in countryside or something, I think it would be much not so easy to do it. And to add one other aspect, many of those problems are not dealt on federal level, but on state level. So we would have to go back a level. But of course, in state level, there's no real other system as in our federal level. It's very, I'm sorry, it's just noise in the background. Window is up. I think the same applies on state level, on municipal level. It's not really a difference from the federal.
Okay, thank you, Professor Tappe. We have received here another question, but before I read this question, maybe Paulo, would you like to make some comments maybe on this matter here, or some question?
No, I'm fine. We could hear the audience questions. Okay,
Paulo. And then, Henning, we have received another question here, and it says, does the federal German budget abides any constitutional explicit objective for the German national state, like inequalities reduction?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. Does the federal German budget abides any constitutional explicit objective for the German national state, like inequalities reduction?
Not in the legally binding, not in the Constitution and not in the Budget Principles Act, but in more on the level of policy, not really more than soft. You could say soft law, and there is something like gender budgeting on a level, but it's not in the Constitution. You can transfer some of the normal principles. So we have a rule that prohibits discrimination, or some rules that say you have to save the natural environment, and so and those have an impact on budget too, but not especially on budget, but they can be read into any policy matter, and so also to the budget. I think there is an exception in the case, especially for the so-called gender budgeting, where the aspects of gender equality has to be has to be regarded in the whole budget process. Yes. This is a kind of new aspect on it, but I'm not sure whether it's on the state level. It's a bit more important, I think, and then when we go into the federal level. But I'm not really sure about it. Sorry.
Okay. No problem. Because as far as I remember, Professor Tappe, you have in the German Constitution, some constitutional principles like the dignity of the human person, of course, equality, the principle of the social state. Yeah, of course, they are general principles from the German state, and then the state derives some financial assistance. Yeah, some financial assistance. You have your social code, for example. Yeah, when you have annually also a provision for the social assistance. For the social assistance, mainly for the ones who are looking for jobs. Yeah, für die Arbeitssuchende. Yeah. But as far as I can remember as well, there are some specific binding provisions in the budgetary system, but regarding social assistance, yeah, social assistance, or what else? Some kind of specific measures to improve the access for young people to the labor market. Is that correct?
Yeah, but it's more in other acts and other law, and not in. It has to be there has to be an impact on the budget. It has to be reflected in the budget process, and of course, expenditure for social aspects is the highest part of the federal budget is about social expenses and so on. But it's not really in the budget law itself, but the budget law sees it as, or you start at the how to put it, you start at the law granting the right to get some money in whatever aspect, and the budget has to take it up. So, but it's not really a budget issue. It's more or less there are other laws, other acts that guarantee some social securities or guarantee other money grants for people, and the budget has to take it up, has to plan for these expenditures, but it's not really seen from the budget aspects, but from the other law. It's a substantive law, you might say.
Okay. Paulo, would you like some other comments or question here? We are almost there at our time. To meet here in Brazil.
It was great, Gustavo. I just like to thank again the professor and you and all the FGV team and the audience. It was a great experience.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you for your comments and your questions. And Professor Tappe, my dear friend Henning, we are almost there at our time. And yeah, as far as we have no further questions here from the audience, and I think Paulo and I have already stressed some issues here regarding our reality. And you can be sure, Henning, about that your answers here, your presentation, first of all, your presentation, your answers here, your comments have already helped us to clarify some of our issues here. And you can be sure that you have given us some kind of light in the way here. We are trying to solve some problems then. And then I thank you very much for that. I know that any kind of presentation we have to prepare, it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. I know you are a very competent professor in Germany and you have a full agenda every day. You have a lot of commitments and issues to solve there at the university. Yeah. But I'm really happy to have you here, Henning. And I need to reiterate here that it's just our first meeting here together, our first event together. I hope we can see each other for the next time here in Rio de Janeiro, so that I can also show you a little about of the city, our institution here, our students. We have really good students here that are really interested in tax law as well, of course. We can prepare something in the tax law for the next time, okay? but I'm really happy to have you here since we haven't seen each other for 10 years back then in Münster. And also I hope you have enjoyed here this hours here with us. Okay.
Yes, I have enjoyed it. I have enjoyed it. And it was a pleasure and it was an honor for me. And I hope I could light a bit of the German system, kind of a spotlight, not really flooding light, but a spotlight on it. And yeah, was very happy to be here in this webinar. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Henning. And thank you once again for the audience here, for our graduate students, for our colleagues here, lawyers, economists, other professors that have joined us here today. And also, I would like to remember you all from the audience that this event, this presentation, this debate here will be hosted at the FGV channel in the YouTube. You can see it after our presentation on the weekend. And for my graduate students, of course, there will be a question in the next and final test of this semester. Okay, so you need to see this presentation. Okay, so thank you very much once again, and I hope I see you soon again. Bye-bye.